Yo. Welcome back to Son of a Preacher Man. As always, I'm your host. Soap Man is in the house. Y'all remember the game Gauntlet? Yeah, so Gauntlet was this video game that came out in the mid 80s. I love this game. It consisted of 4 characters, a strong barbarian type guy, an elf who had a bow and arrow, a female warrior like a Valkyrie type character, and a wizard. Now, each one of these characters had like positives and negatives that came with them, like, good things that they were good at, things that they weren't so good, because I want to focus and hone in on the wizard. How is it that this old man even competes with the rest of these guys? I just want to explore this dichotomy between the wizard and the warrior. So how is it, who would win between the wizard and the warrior? How can the wizard compete with the warrior? The simple answer is magic. The wizard uses magic, okay? This old man, he may be old, he may be feeble, he may be slow, but he's not stupid. And that's what he brings to the game. Just like the wizard in the Gauntlet video game, the wizard has a high attack output. He may be old and feeble, but he's not weak by any means. While the warrior was doing push-ups and sit-ups, the wizard had his face in books. That's what he brings to the table. He knows things that the warrior doesn't know. He can do things that the warrior cannot do. What that results in is the mage or the wizard or the sorcerer seeming to do the impossible. It's not just that he knows things that the warrior doesn't know, or that he can do things that the warrior can't do. What he does borderlines or surpasses what seems to be the impossible. So the simple, quick answer is just magic. But when we take a closer look, these mages or sorcerers, whatever you want to call them, they go by different titles depending on what time period you're talking about. But when we take a closer look, it's not just magic that the mage brings to the table. It's kind of like wisdom. A lot of times we'll see, depictions of these wizards or sorcerers, and they have a fondness or an affinity for nature. You know what I mean? A lot of times they're animal friendly. Animals are part of nature. So a lot of times you will see these mages, they're friendly with animals, or they're nature friendly, or they work with nature some kind of way, shape, or form. It's signature and typical for them to be older, have a long white beard, a hood, or a pointy hat. But it's not just an affinity for nature. They seem to have found the ability to tap into its secrets and wield its greatest power. And so when you see these sorcerers doing things that seem impossible or that you can't understand, it's scary. It's scary. That's how the mage, that's how the sorcerer competes with the warrior. He's terrifying. Look at this picture of Merlin. He checks off all the boxes. Pointy hat, older gentleman, long white beard. He's got a staff. A lot of these sorcerers can't be a sorcerer without a staff, like you can't be a witch without a broomstick. And look, you see he's animal friendly. He's nature friendly. He checks off all the boxes. Remember Gandalf? Remember Gandalf from Lord of the Rings? You shall In my last episode, we discussed the first couple chapters of Genesis. We honed in on the first 3 words, in the beginning. We aimed to find out what were these things already existing in the beginning. Darkness, face of the deep, and face of the waters. Now I could just flat out tell you what they were, but I'm not going to do that. Because first of all, I don't think you would believe me because you wouldn't understand. I think it's better if I just show you how I came upon this information. I think it's just better if I show you how I know. In order to understand what happened in the beginning, we need to understand who's telling the story. The story is called the creation story. It's an ancient story that's been told for thousands of years before we came along. It was told for thousands of years before Moses came along. So Moses is the author of the creation story that is most known to Christians and probably most of the people viewing right now. So why did I take you through this whole charade with wizards and sorcerers and talking about video games that came out in the mid 80s? Well, it's because I think it's important that you understand that Moses is cut from that cloth. He's of that ilk, if you will. And I think it's important that you understand that the author of the story that we're trying to understand is kind of like a Gandalf Merlin kind of character. So Moses is the author of what we call the creation story. And if you don't know who he is, you have been living under a rock. He is an alleged historical figure whose very existence is hotly contested. Nevertheless, he was successful in practically everything he did. He was extremely close to God. Not many were closer to God than Moses. And he left a legacy that I don't think can be rivaled. Now, one last thing about Moses I need you to know. In my last video, or in 2 videos ago, we talked about theologians, modern day theologians. Well, Moses is an ancient theologian, and he's a lot like modern day theologians in that he studies ancient history, he studies ancient religion, he speaks multiple languages, he crosses over as a priest. He's all that in a bag of chips. He would have been thoroughly educated in Egyptian tradition and religion. So the difference between Moses and everyone else that I want to highlight is that this man is a genius. And I made 3 videos called The Genius of Moses. You can check them out if you get a chance. I would not have went through the effort of making those videos about Moses being a genius if it wasn't a big deal. It is the crux to everything he does. You cannot separate it from him. It is what sets him apart. But that's for another video, another episode. So, like modern day theologians, Moses would have stayed up long nights studying, poring over documents. I think back at the time when Moses lived in Egypt, his title would have been a scribe or high priest or either one. He was certainly being groomed to be Pharaoh, but the point I'm trying to get across is he would have spent a lot of time studying, just like modern day theologians, studying religion, studying Egyptian tradition, studying Mesopotamian religion and tradition, studying ancient Persian religion and tradition. He was well-to-do, he was high up, He was a genius. He was famous. He was recognized. He was popular. And he was the best at what he did. Poring over documents, making copies, always studying, always praying, always teaching, judging. Remember, that's what modern day theologians do. Everything about their lives, every aspect revolves around understanding and serving God. Moses would have been no different. So he has access to the wealth of knowledge and information that Egypt has accumulated over the years. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. You have this man who is a phenomenon when it comes to his intellect. And he has access to all of the knowledge and resources of Egypt, all of the history of Egypt. He's a priest or a scribe or whatever they were called at the time. So by way of his occupation, he would have been aware of the creation story. He would have heard all the stories that came prior to him or during his time. He would have seen most, if not all, of the writings and current writings and ancient writings. No different than modern day scribes or modern day theologians or modern day archaeologists or modern day scientists. Don't get caught up in the words. They all mean the same thing. So Moses sits down to write this creation story. Where do you think it comes from? Do you think a voice just came out of the clouds and said, "Oh, hey, Moses, listen up. Here's what happened. Thus saith the Lord"? Of course not. This story that Moses writes has already been written. It's already in existence. Moses is retelling a story that has been told and passed down for thousands of years prior to him being born, okay? That's what I want to hammer home. This story's already in existence. Now, folks, let's talk about exactly where this story came from. We need to understand where the creation story originated from, where it started. Where was the earliest known telling of this story? And the answer is called Mesopotamia. Now, Mesopotamia is in modern day, well, Mesopotamia was where modern day Iraq and Iran would be. Mesopotamia is called the land between two rivers, referring to the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. It's also known as Heaven's Gate, or a part of it. A city that's going to be called Babylon is going to be known as Heaven's Gate. This land, just really quickly, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This land is a sweet spot on earth. It's between two rivers. It's like nice and fertile. It's good for like agriculture, and people in this area are going to thrive. Now, at the end, or at the southern tip of Mesopotamia, was a place called Sumer. And that's where we want to focus and hone in on, because that is the earliest telling of the creation story. Now, Sumer is in both Mesopotamia and what is called the Fertile Crescent. If you go back, let's go back a slide. If you see my pointer here, here is the Tigris River and here is the Euphrates River, and they empty into the Persian Gulf. So all of this land in and around and about and in between these two rivers is what is considered Mesopotamia. Now, if you go over here to the left, you see all this in green. All this in green represents what is called the Fertile Crescent. So on one end of the Fertile Crescent is Mesopotamia, or one arm of the Fertile Crescent is Mesopotamia, and the other arm is Egypt. And you'll notice in Egypt, like in Mesopotamia, they have a great river running through the land, which would probably be a desert if it wasn't for that river. It is the river Nile over here is literally the lifeblood of Egypt. But folks, before we go on, let me emphasize, these are not the only places on earth who are benefiting from an environment like this. There are many similar circumstances going on around the world, such as the Indus Valley civilization, and we'll talk about them briefly. So we need to talk about the Sumerian people. Okay, so who were the Sumerians? Turns out we know a lot about the Sumerian people from all the ancient archaeological artifacts that we've dug up. We know that they were a highly advanced social culture in comparison to their peers during those times, during ancient times. We know that they were the first, or at least they are regarded as the first to do everything. We know they were around from around 3500 BCE to 1750 BCE. We also know that they were non-Semitic and spoke a language of their own, not related to any other language. Okay, so now let's just talk about them like a little bit more loosely. A lot of people think that these Sumerian people were black. I do not think so. Look at their nose. Do that look like a black nose to you? The Sumerian people called themselves the black-headed people. And a lot of people believe that they were black because they called themselves the black-headed people, as if people that were non-African couldn't have black hair or something. I don't understand it. You can look at these people's nose and tell they ain't black. That's the point I want to get across. And I know that may sound silly, but to me, just because a person says that they're the black-headed people, I can see you jumping to the conclusion that they were black, but to me, that's not enough evidence. The depictions that they give of themselves, to me, do not resemble black people. I understand the urge of some black people to want to affiliate themselves with the Sumerians so that they could feel better about themselves and feel better about being black, as if you should need a reason to feel good about being black. But folks, these people, I do not believe were black. Look, these were a great people, and they don't have to be black. Every time somebody does something great, everybody want to bend over backward and associate themselves with those people. But I personally think that they came from the Indus Valley civilization, which is just east of the Zagros Mountains, which would be modern day Iran. I think they came from that area, honestly, but it is possible that they had sailed up from Africa. I'm not saying it's impossible that they was black, or it is possible that they descendants of Africans who came out of Africa. You know, let's get one thing straight. It said that the Sumerians started everything. It said that they invented the wheel, because we found evidence of where they started using wheels, you know, as pottery wheels to make pottery. Let's get one thing straight, okay? I want to say two quick things, okay? I am not the type of person, what's true is true and what's not is not. I'm not the type of person I'm not one of these Afrocentrist dudes who gonna give false credit to black people because I'm black. I'm not finna lean bias because I'm black. If somebody is great and they white, like Alexander the Great, I'm gonna give them they flowers and give props where props is due, even if they are racist SOB. You give props where props is due, okay? You put the square peg in the square hole and the circle peg in the circle. You do what's right. These were great people. That's not taking anything away from black people to give other cultures and other people they props. Now, with that being said, everything started in Africa. Don't make me prove it. The Sumerians are regarded as the people who started everything. The reason for this is because of what they were able to do with those things. But let's be clear. All people came from Africa, and all these inventions, language, art, the wheel, math, it all came from Africa. So let's not get that confused. Here, let me prove it. Let me take a couple minutes to prove.
As we all know, Africa is the cradle of human origins. All human species have their origins in Africa if we go back far enough.
Did you hear what the lady said? If you didn't, she said, all human species have their origins in Africa, which means that everybody around the earth at some point in time came out of Africa. They didn't have to all come out at the same time. I know a big mass of people came out 50 or 60,000 years ago, as the lady just said. But come on, use some common sense. People were always exiting Africa for thousands upon tens upon thousands of years before the mass exodus. There were many mass exoduses out of Africa. And I know a lot of people don't like to hear that. A lot of people don't like to think, and they try to dig and scrounge and scratch for evidence that their origins aren't in Africa. But the problem that they run into is that all the evidence points to the fact that all human species came from Africa. So you see, what I'm trying to show you is some authenticity and some honesty. You give credit what credit is due, regardless of whether you like it or not. So as far as something like the wheel being invented in Sumeria by the Sumerians, it's perfectly okay to give them credit for what they did with the wheel and with a lot of other things. But let's be clear, everything started in Africa. It just did. The Sumerians don't have to be black, but everything started in Africa. This is the Ishango bone found in Africa, estimated to be around 20,000 years old. The little cuts and notches that you see into the bone are some of the earliest signs of people doing math. This is the Lebombo bone. Lebombo, I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. But you can see, like the Ishango bone, you see these little notches in the bone? These people were counting. The Lebombo bone is estimated to be as old as 43,000 years old. So the Sumerians come along 3,500 BCE, probably before that. So would you say that 20 or 30 years before that, if people were counting 20 or 30,000 years before the Sumerians came along, it wouldn't be a hard sell to suggest they came up with a lot of these things. Give the Sumerians credit for taking it to another level. But I mean, just use your common sense. If people were using or beginning to use math, or we don't even know, they could have been using it for thousands of years prior to this. But if people were using math 30,000, almost possibly 40,000 years before the Sumerians, I think it's safe to assume they knew what a wheel was. We know the Sumerians were the first people to get organized, set up governments. Folks, they had schools, marked and established territories, and we have evidence of the first wars being by the Sumerians. So the oldest ever recorded war was a war amongst the Sumerians. They were a number of city-states that began fighting one another, and they waged war. And we know about a lot of the things they did because they left it in stone. The Sumerians were famous for their clay tablets, or what started out as pictures on clay tablets. We know of the wars they waged through the clay tablets and the cylinder seals that they left behind, the reliefs of their exploits etched in stone. We know how they thought. We know what they believed. And most importantly, we know how they worshiped. We know their gods because they told us. They left that information behind in pictures and in artwork. We know their names. We know the names of their gods. We know the hierarchy of many of the gods of Sumer. We know that they extended from the highest heights of the heavens down to the lesser guardians that roam the earth. Now, here's another thing, folks. I said that I believe the Sumerians were part of this Indus Valley civilization that is where modern India and Pakistan would be. And the reason I believe that is because they worshipped a lot of the same gods. The gods of the Indus Valley civilization were very similar in name and nature to the Sumerian gods. That's why I believe the Sumerians came from that area. So anyway, we know how they worshipped. We know their gods. We know the name of their gods, and we know the names and identities of a lot of their lesser gods and guardians. These lesser gods and guardians, you may have heard of them, all this talk about the Anunnaki and aliens coming down to earth and teaching man civilization. We are going to get to all that in due time. Right now, I just want to focus on what happened in the beginning, but I promise you, I am going to disappoint you when we talk about the Anunnaki, what they really are, and space aliens and all the stuff that y'all like to fool y'allself with, okay? We will get to it all. Anywho, so we know about their gods. We know about the hierarchy of their gods. We know about their lesser gods and guardians whom they use to come down and teach mankind. And they did talk about these things in their stories about gods coming down and ruling them and teaching them and making them rulers. It's all true. They did say that. So yes, the Sumerians did say that gods came down and ruled them and chose rulers among them. And that's why people think aliens, the Anunnaki and the Agigi are aliens. I'm not going to dive all off into that because, everybody not on the same page with that. I will address it as we get to it. It's sadly disappointing and a misinterpretation of what the Sumerians are saying. That's why it's important. If you gonna understand what these people are saying, if you gonna understand the creation story, that's why you need to understand where it came from. You need to understand the people who are telling the story, not just Moses, the people who told it originally long before he got there, before he got here or there, whatever. So their gods or lesser gods or guardians had contact with men, supposedly. You may have heard about the half men, half bird gods, or the half men, half fish gods, Oannes. Some of these terms may be familiar to some of you, the Apkallu. And we'll touch on all that, I promise you. These half god, half man sages that taught mankind all of its secrets. Well, all of these legends and beliefs stem from the Sumerian people in southern Mesopotamia. Okay, so as if the artwork and the reliefs in stone weren't enough. They were actually superb engineers and builders, which show their knowledge of math. Here's another slide of their fish gods. And this god Dagon to the right, he is worshipped as far as, the Levant and Africa. You see that name come up a lot. You see it come up in different names. So something strange definitely happened a long time ago, but I don't want to get off into that this episode. I want to stay focused. So in addition to the many great things that the Sumerians were known for, were famous for, the building of these temples and structures are certainly at the forefront, okay? And we call them today ziggurats. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard this and know this, but I'm just quickly touching it for those who may be lagging a little bit behind. As you see in the slide, these temples or these ziggurats, they would have been the focal point of the city. They would have been the nucleus of the city-state. Everything would have been about these temples. They were usually places of worship. And as you see in the slide, it's busy around this place. You got a lot of wagons being dragged. You probably got a lot of goods being sold, trade, a lot of money being exchanged. Do you remember the story of the Tower of Babel in the Bible? So it's now mostly agreed upon, at least in the scientific community, that the tower in the Tower of Babel was not a tower at all, but was most likely a ziggurat. Now, I know to your advanced eye and mind, someone who's seen sights beyond, this simple stack of blocks. This may not be much to you, but I assure you, if you lived back in these times, this would have been the greatest sight your eyes had ever witnessed. Now, getting to the final contribution of the Sumerian people, they left us writing. They were one of the very first people to form writing systems and languages, and we call that writing system today cuneiform. The Sumerians, along with the people in Kemet, or in Egypt, were the first people to form writing systems. It started off as artwork. We know that from the Egyptians, that's how their writing system started out. It started off as artwork and then formed into little symbols that were interpreted with meaning. So, just like the Egyptians, the Sumerians formed a writing system right about the same time, or maybe even a little bit before. And they took it a step further. They started making impressions into clay tablets, and we call this form of writing cuneiform. And it spread and was used for a very long time. So the Sumerians give them their flowers. They were good at what they did, and they should get the respect, and they should get the reward, and they should get the reputation that they have for what they was able to do with their writing system. So for a long time, a lot of these tablets sat up in museums until we learned how to read them. And when we did, we discovered the creation story. So once we learned to read their writing, we got to reading, we got to discovering, we got to learning all about the Sumerians, and we came across this story called the creation story. And we took it to be a myth and a legend about how the universe came into existence. Okay, so folks, what I need you to understand about what the Sumerians did and started is that it spread. What Sumer starts, the Babylonians adopt. They're very close in their beliefs to the Sumerians. They believe in the same gods. When they tell this, the Sumerians come up with this creation story. The Babylonians adopt it. They retell it. And it's slightly different from the Sumerians. Not much, but slightly different. But enough where you can see that it's the same story. So when the Sumerians fall and the Babylonians come to power, they tell the creation story. And when the Babylonians fall and the Assyrians in Assyria come to power, they tell their own slightly different creation story. So what you see and what follows what the Sumerians started is power. The Sumerians get credit for all these things. They're the first people to establish boundaries. They're the first people to, have standing armies. They're the first people to have schools and governments. They start erecting these temples. But after their reign, the Babylonians, who are their neighbors, they come into power and they do the same thing as the Sumerians, but slightly different in their own way. And this has a domino effect all up and down, mostly up Mesopotamia. And guess what happens? While this is going on in Sumer, the same thing is happening in Egypt. Egypt is neck and neck with Sumer in establishing writing systems and governments and schools. They are neck and neck, and I think it's important to understand that. This Fertile Crescent, it's a big argument as to where life started in the Fertile Crescent. Did it start in southern Mesopotamia? Did it start in Egypt? It's a lot of good arguments on both sides. Back to the Sumerians, because here is the oldest known telling of the creation story, and it is in Sumer in southern Mesopotamia, which had a big influence on Babylon or Babylonia and Assyria. This is a stone found in the area of ancient Babylon. It was found in the 1800s, I think around 1850, and it is called, the story that is interpreted from the cuneiform writing on the stone is called the Enuma Elish. It's basically another name for the creation story because it's very similar to the story that Moses is going to tell. For a long time, it sat in a museum collecting dust. Then scientists learned to read its cuneiform script. We learned that the stone was a recording of the creation of the universe. It's called the Enuma Elish, and it is just one of the earliest versions of the creation story, and it's the Babylonian version. But there is also an Egyptian version, and if we fast forward to the time of Moses in Egypt, then it is safe to assume that when Moses sits down to write his version, he is well aware of the Sumerian version of the creation story, the Babylonian version, the Assyrian version, and the Egyptian version. He is aware, he has read, he has studied as an ancient theologian, as an ancient scribe. He has studied all of these versions of the creation story. But here's the key difference between Moses and everyone else. He is an absolute genius. He is a phenom. So all the creation stories are pretty much the same, except for the names of the many gods in the stories. The Egyptian creation story, like all the other creation stories, are overpopulated with gods. Everything is a god. The sky is a god. The land is God. Moisture is God. The air is God. I'm not going to get off deep into the Egyptian culture or the Egyptian creation story. All you really need to know about the Egyptian creation story is that it is very similar to all the other creation stories and that it is chock full of gods. Now, it goes without saying that the Egyptian version of the creation story is unique from the others in that the gods are uniquely Egyptian. Everything else is essentially the same. Okay, listen closely because I'm coming up to my grand finale. If you pay attention to the first part of all the stories, no matter if it's the Egyptian part, no matter if it's the Egyptian one, the Babylonian one, or the Assyrian one, it doesn't matter, or the Sumerian one, because they're all similar enough. We just gonna hone in on the very beginning. Look at my screen, please. I'm gonna give you a brief synopsis, very brief, of how the Egyptian creation story goes. Okay, pay very close attention and I'm gonna make this quick, okay? The Egyptian creation story starts off with what they call the Sea of Chaos, okay? And so out of this Sea of Chaos comes this God. That's where you see this picture right here. And the God has no place to stand, so it makes land for itself. I'm not exactly right with this. I'm not an Egyptologist. It goes something like this. This God emerges out of what is called this Sea of Chaos. And the God, he either is land or somehow creates land for himself. Then he has 2 kids. Those kids go off and become land and air. Okay? Something like that, okay? It's just the very beginning that I'm concerned with. This Sea of Chaos. Okay, now let's go to the Babylonian version, okay? Listen very closely to what I'm about to read to you. It says, "In the beginning, there was nothing. A mound of earth rose from the noon." The noon is the same as what the Egyptians call a sea of chaos. But remember, it says, "In the beginning, there was nothing." This is very similar to the story that the Egyptians tell and the story that Moses is going to tell. Remember, in the Egyptian story, there's just this sea of chaos. There's nothing but this sea. And this entity rises up out of the sea. Okay? You got that? That's not a lot for you to retain. There's a sea of chaos, a sea of mass nothingness and confusion, or something we don't understand, and a god or entity or land mass or something rises up out of this sea. Got it? According to the Babylonian version says, "In the beginning there was this noon," or the Egyptians call it a sea of chaos, okay? And out of this sea of chaos, a God emerges, and so the universe is created. I just want to hone in on the sea of chaos because it is the key clue to understanding what these 3 things are in existence: this darkness, face of the waters, and the deep. Now, the Egyptians love their gods. It's no doubt about that. The Egyptians love their gods. There are literally hundreds of them, probably thousands. And, they have a hierarchy of which ones are, deserve to be at the top and, they're lesser gods, kind of like the Sumerians and Babylonians. So, like I said before, I'm not even about to begin to delve off into the abyss and bottomless well of Egyptian gods. That's not my point. My only point in talking about the Egyptian gods and their version of the creation story, really everybody's version of the creation story, my only reason for bringing it up is to highlight how different Moses' version is. Moses' version of the creation story is only different in one way. He doesn't have a lot of gods in his creation story. He only has one. It's one thing that makes Moses' story very different from the other creation stories. In Moses' creation story, there is but one God. The wind is the wind. The earth is the earth. The heavens are the heavens. And there is but one God that governs it all. This is very different from the ideology of the Egyptians. And this difference in ideologies will ultimately prove to be fatal and prove to be the fatal undoing of the Egyptians later on. The Egyptians, they call this situation at the beginning of time, they call it the Sea of Chaos. The Babylonians and the Sumerians, they call it the Noon. But it's clear they're talking about the exact same thing. This sea of chaos, of mass confusion. What is it? It makes no sense. A sea of chaos. I know exactly what you're thinking. It's the same mistake I made when I was trying to figure this out. The Bible says, well, Moses says in the Bible, God moved upon the face of the waters. Similarly to the Egyptian creation story and the Babylonian creation story, it seems to be this watery situation and a God. Both are present. Water is present and God is present. Moses says in the Bible, in the beginning of Genesis, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. You have the exact same instance in the Egyptian creation story, where the Egyptians say that in the beginning there was a sea of chaos, and that a God emerged and established himself on a mound. The Babylonian version starts out with, there was nothing but a sea of noon. And I know what you're thinking when you try to imagine it in your mind. This is what you're thinking. A sea, water. But let me help you understand the mistake you're making. Remember this. The earth has not been created yet. Let me say that again. The earth has yet to be created. So let me say this again. The earth has not yet been created. So the slide on your screen is impossible. You're thinking when the Egyptian creation story says a sea of chaos, I know this is what you're thinking. And a mound emerged from the sea. Your terrestrial mind goes back to what it knows. A sea like the ones on earth, a mound like the ones on earth. But the earth has not been created yet. That's not what they're talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, we're trying to figure out what are these things in existence in the beginning. The darkness, the face of the deep, and the face of the waters. What the Bible, or rather what Moses is describing at the beginning of Genesis, is a black hole. And I'm going to prove it to you in my next episode.